Halloween Pop 2021. Welcome to our roundtable discussion, Zombies, Blips, and the Apocalypse. Why write stories about disruptions? I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scott, a cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. And today we're going to discuss a few disruptive narratives and ask the question, why on God's green earth do we spend so much time writing and thinking about the end of days? So joining me in today's discussion is an illustrious panel of professional story writers, as well as renowned psychologists, philosophers, and anthropologists. Panel members, please tell us a little something about who you are, the title of the disruption tale you're going to tell us today, and the strongest memory you have of encountering that tale. And we will start with Victor.
Hello, I'm Victor Dandridge, hardest working man in comics. I'm a self-publishing comic creator from Columbus, Ohio, publishing through my imprint Vantage Inhouse Productions. And the story that I'm going to talk about is the Age of Apocalypse storyline for Marvel Comics, started in the mid-90s, about 1996 to 1997. One of my favorite memories of it was being a young adolescent reader of comics and seeing the range of change that could happen in this concept, in this story. It was fantastic. Can I just tell you guys a little bit about like what this is? Oh my God. Okay. So the most amazing concept is that it is a series after a series, right? So it's all really focused on the absence of one man and one man's dream. And coming in, literally almost 30 years after the civil rights movement, 30 years after the X-Men had been founded as a comic book concept, this idea of taking the one person that began it all, Charles Xavier, and subtracting him from the equation and seeing what happens to the Marvel Universe without this one man and his profound dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants.
It transported me back there, Victor.
Dude,
I was suddenly 16 again.
Right?
It's
such a good series.
Thank you very much, Victor. How about you, Alex?
Huh? Oh, yeah. I'm Alex Simmons. I'm a freelance writer, a writing coach and consultant, and a number of other things that are all creative and wonderful. I'm the creator of an adventure series called Blackjack, Tales of an African-American Soldier Fortune in the 1930s. I've written for DC, Marvel, and a number of independent companies, as well as I've written plays and novels for children, and it's just a wonderful experience of traveling the world and speaking on writing and creativity and comics over chaos and people over politics. And my favorite story, disruptive tale, actually is The Time Machine and the 1960s version of that. And I'll explain why when I come up a little later in the show.
Fantastic. Alex, do you have a robust memory of The Time Machine? Watching it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Can
absolutely.
you share that with us?
Yeah, well, I guess I was probably about 10 when I saw it, and I saw it in the movie theater, and that's one thing that plasma screens will never replace is a 50-foot screen and super galactic, gigantic imagery and before these tiny eyes, with you're sitting there with the popcorn and everything. So I was in the Riverside movie theater, which was on Broadway and 95th Street at the time, and I remember it was a Friday afternoon, and it's, if you know the story, I'm not going to go into the whole thing now, but if you know the story, it starts in the early, the late 1800s, early 1900s in England, and then eventually, boom, you're into the future. So for me, it was this double glorious package of the Sherlock Holmes kind of environment of Victorian England and mystery, which I love, and I was like really into that. And then boom, we're into the future, and there's a whole nother experience. And I just remember just chowing down on Raisinets, popcorn, messy fingers, and loving it with Rod Taylor and Yvette Mimieux and all the other cast members. And it was, it's a film that I watched several times since and still enjoy immensely.
That's fantastic. Awesome. Walking out of the theater saying, I'm going to be a writer.
No, actually, I was going to invent my own time machine. I'm very clear on that. Yeah, I'm going to write nothing. I'm going to travel.
You're going to travel, man. I'm going to do it. How about you, Eric?
So I'm Dr. Eric Wesselman. I'm a social psychologist at Illinois State University. Most of my research focuses on the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion in daily life. More recently, I've started thinking about the sort of psychology of storytelling in various ways, and so I've been working that into my teaching. The narrative that I'm going to use is the original Night of the Living Dead, so I'm a big Romero fan, and my most robust memory is seeing it the first time I saw it in graduate school. Sad that it took me that long to see it, but I, grown up watching a lot of horror, and this one, the ending really disturbed me, and stuck with me. And now I watch it so much that my wife's favorite story of me in this tale is that one time she woke up really early to go to work. She was commuting, and I wasn't able to sleep that night, insomnia problems. So what did I do? I popped on Night of the Living Dead. She's like, so let me get this straight. You're having trouble sleeping, and so you're watching a horror film.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, that makes sense to me. I don't
Perfect
understand the
sense,
issue with
man. Perfect sense. All right, how about you, Stanford?
Okay. My name is Stanford Carpenter. I am a cultural anthropologist. I'm based out of Chicago, Illinois. But before I was an anthropologist, I was doing a lot of stuff in comics, but also archaeology. And I say that because when I watch a horror film, it's actually oftentimes it's the inner archaeologist in me that gets channeled, because when I was doing that, I mean, I had the experience of just being dropped into very rugged locales, and with a small group of people and no way to contact the outside world, and you just had to like figure it out. And my job was as a map maker and site illustrator. So I would be that guy who would always leave the group and go deeper into the jungle. So yeah, that's that I bring that up because that's what I think about, and that's what makes it actually makes horror films both fun and disappointing, because I'm the guy who, when watching the horror film where it's a small group of people in the middle of nowhere, I'm like, what they're doing makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah. He's a plot killer.
But along those lines, the story that I want to share with you is The Girl with All the Gifts. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about the movie version of The Girl with All the Gifts that actually had Glenn Close in it. It's one of those things where one of those movies that people forget that Glenn Close was in it.
Right.
But Glenn Close, or not Glenn Close, but The Girl with All the Gifts it's essentially a zombie film, but it really took me in because when I saw it, it was something where I'd heard about it. I'd heard that it was pretty decent. It was cold out. I wasn't going out anywhere, so I was just alone. It was a very solitary experience. But there are several moments where like I looked at it and I was like, this makes sense. This makes sense in relationship to my experiences with these types of situations. And it also did something else, which was something I've been concerned about, because I've also taught a couple courses on surviving horror films, because I think the survival issues are really interesting. But it didn't just take the issue of survival or lack thereof, but it also asked the question, and we'll get into it later when I go into more detail, what next? And that's something that we don't really see in any of the zombie genre. It is basically a genre that is trapped in the midst of the crisis, and we rarely ever see what's next.
Right.
Yeah, fantastic. Can't wait to hear your story. So, as I said earlier, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, cognitive psychologist, philosopher at Illinois State University. I study the unconscious anticipations that we bring into every moment of action, every moment of perception, and every moment of thought, and we use these unconscious assumptions to distinguish ourselves from the rest of the world, and that lets us be someone. So my tale of disruption is Arthur C. Clarke's 1953 novel, Childhood's End. And I'm not going to say anything about the plot right now. What I'll tell you is that my brother was taking a science fiction class in high school. I was probably 13 at the time. And then 3 years later, I just find the book laying around. It had a really cool, huge picture, a huge spaceship on the front of it. And I read this book and it blew my mind. It just changed the type of stories I thought stories were. And I wasn't really cognizant of it, right? It's just like, what the hell? And I went on with my life, you know, and then years later, turns out this is what I studied, right? Surprise is a disruption. And then I remember Eric and I were at Comic-Con, as were all of you actually, back in 18. And Eric and I were having drinks with an Italian couple, and I sit there and I tell them the story of childhood's end. And of course, their eyes were real wide when I was telling it. I said, okay, this is a good story. If I can do it in 5 minutes with these people, I can pass it on from here. So, I just great memories, and really glad we're all here today to talk about why we tell disruptive tales. So now we're each going to share a disruptive tale and say a few words about why we think the tale was written. Then we're going to discuss that as a group, answering questions such as, are these stories warnings? Are they meant to be self-help narratives? Or are post-blip or post-disruption narratives actually just hopelessly constrained by pre-disruption, pre-blip thinking? So Victor has actually volunteered to go first. So Victor, please, the stage is yours.
The lead into it was a short miniseries, which was really fun, called Legion Quest. And this was just really set up to establish how this occurs, to go back in real time, so to speak, and subtract a person's existence. His son, Legion, David, goes back in time with the intent that if only I could get rid of Magneto, everything would be different. My father would get the ultimate chance to fulfill his dream, because as you look at things, the juxtaposition of Charles Xavier and Magneto as his direct antithesis, he is the person that stopped everything from happening in David's fractured mind. And upon, you know, the time frame that he goes back, it is before the set up foundation of the X-Men. At the time, Charles and Eric Lyncher, Magneto, are still friends, and literally the first mutants that either have ever encountered. So they are protective of each other in a brothers like sense. And so when David appears to take out Magneto, Charles jumps in the way. You know, he sacrifices himself to save his friend and inadvertently causes this crazy time loop, because as David, who is Charles's son, kills his father, could never exist, everything changes, and boom, we're now into this new world. Now, what's really amazing is that it's this great kind of showcase of how individual people can matter to an entire population. Charles Xavier is gone. So his dream of founding the X-Men and finding this way to showcase how people can get along is disrupted. Who was his mortal enemy in terms of ideologies is Magneto, who now takes his place. A bastardized version of what Charles Xavier does. Yes, he founds the X-Men. Are they as good as Charles's future versions? No, not quite. Why? How can you tell this? Because the new player, the namesake of this entire series, Apocalypse, has risen to power without any real opposition and has destroyed what is this world. And what's absolutely fantastic about it is this whole exploration of one person being the change. Everybody is this single individual that can change things, make things go back, make things, you know, work well. That's what it's all about, is finding this one person that matters. There's so many different, apocalyptic ideas where it's one person who helps everyone survive or shows people the way, but it's something else to say there's one person that was responsible, one person that you can go to that will fix it, one person that you can go to that really, even in the midst of the apocalypse, is worse than the apocalypse. Like, there's always these one, individualized entities that represent so many different facets. Again, in this one, the saving grace of the whole thing is the time lost character Bishop, who also survives this time warp because he's already time displaced, but he of course is suffering this mental delusion, not quite sure, the change in timelines has fried his brains just a little bit, but he is the linchpin to go back, to fix things, to find the right catalyst point of how can we avoid this apocalypse and reset everything as it should be. But of course, the thing that makes this so amazing is that while they have, directly averted one particular apocalypse, the future that they reset absolutely puts you on the same timeline that Bishop came from, which ultimately leads to another apocalypse. So it's just this beautiful concept of one person mattering enough to maybe stave off or hold off an apocalypse, but the apocalypse is always inevitable. and it's one of the coolest stories. You see some of the coolest things. I personally love it, and yeah, that one, Age of Apocalypse, gets me every time.
And Jimmy Stewart was playing.
Every time a human dies, a mutant goes
Gets
up
his
in the
wings.
ranks. That's what happens.
Can we give Victor a round of applause for that
Yeah.
fantastic
Thank
storytelling?
you. So part of the reason why I think this story was written is at the time in comics in particular, there was a lot of big marketing to do when it comes to disrupting concepts, killing characters, taking them out of the game. And when it came to the X-Men, a group dynamic, it was almost impossible to pick a single X-Men person that you could take out that would have the necessary idea behind it, right? You could take out Cyclops. Some people would care, some people would not. You could take out Wolverine. That would be a weird story, as he was definitely the most popular X-Men at the time. So how do you do that effectively and still get the sales? That would be hard. So you take out a person that has a significant place within the X-Men story, but would not necessarily be so greatly missed that you couldn't tell a fascinating action-packed story that hits all the beats that everyone wants to see. The logical person definitely was Charles Xavier. To set up the idea that by removing him, you recast the entire storyline of the X-Men as this tragic story, not necessarily this hopeful piece of people trying to survive in a world that, ideally speaking, should be fit for them, because now the person that has risen to power is this prolific, very powerful mutant who has almost destroyed humanity on his own. You would think the idea of the proliferation of mutants would be the prevalent idea, but instead it becomes this thing of saying, here is another mutant who arguably has the same mentality as Charles Xavier. He wants peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, although in the regular 616 universe, he's just willing to kill humans to get it. Like, he's very willing to do that. Here's him going, okay, I am, one bit of this spectrum. Apocalypse is too far on this spectrum, and we need to rein this back in. We need to find something else that we can do, not even necessarily to help the humans, but to help us, because in truth, him being in power is devastating to everybody. He is too far. He is a bridge over way too far, and it's not even a sense of, we are, as mutants, the dominant factors. We are barely surviving as well. So this is that kind of great lens of an extreme, kind of looking at it and saying, okay, this is too much. How do we bring this back? And what was the best bastion of this? That would be Professor Charles Xavier. His ideal behind it was great. And so at the time of comics, again, the death of Superman, the Nightfall series that breaks Batman's back, what can Marvel do to kind of, keep pace with that same sort of scenario? Let's take out Charles Xavier and see what happens.
One of the things that I really like about this series, and Victor's kind of touched on some of these things, is, it really is it's an extended what if, right? Whereas the regular What If series maybe might have 2 or 3 comics at most, right, to tell a longer story. This was 8 titles that went on for
a whole month, or 4 issues each. Yeah, right, so essentially 4 months worth. Yeah. So, and just, it was such a vast universe that they were able to touch on and run the simulation of, well, how much does one person matter, right? And does that person then ultimately influence the environment that these characters are then raised in, right? And so some of the characters who were previously good in the 616 universe become bad, and vice versa. But some of them, are maybe raised in a good or bad environment, but then like Cyclops, for example, has some dispositional characteristics that sort of bend him back towards, I guess we'll call it Magneto's dream here, instead of Xavier's, right? So there's more of a person or a nature as opposed to nurture for his character.
Yeah, I tend to find that, and I was talking to somebody about this the other day because of some student questions, writing student questions, and that is, how do you make your villains sympathetic? And how do you make your villains compelling as opposed to just stereotypical good guy, bad guy? And certainly, like with Ra's al Ghul and a few others and even Thanos, where, okay, I get what you're trying to solve, but damn, that's a little too extreme. I mean, can't we talk about this?
Right.
It's like your audience is suddenly going, oh, well, wait a minute. Wow, the argument is valid. So is it the methodology you have a problem with, or I just don't like your face? So I think that this was a great example of that, and I think Marvel really, especially in that time period, was doing some wonderful things about that. Because I often talk about Kurt, and Nightcrawler, and his storyline of being so religious and yet looking like a demon, and the conflicts that he was going through. So I think it was a great example or a great opportunity, which Marvel took full advantage of really exploring characters. And really exploring motivations and reactions, and then to explore the greater social question, the great societal question: what are we? And if you want to take in also the race scenario, okay, yeah, how are we dealing with race and cultural clashes and things like that? And what would happen if we went to this far extreme in the real world? Dag, let's think about this. So I think that was all great work on their part.
Yeah, I like this idea of, Xavier was the one who said, let's all work together, right? And so someone who lives that force, someone who lives that way of thinking, it's kind of obvious when you take them out of the play, it's going to influence the lives of those he brought together. At the same time, it also speaks to his dependence on them, right? In other words, Scott had his story, Wolverine had his story, Jean had her story, and all of those stories constrained each other. And I like that idea of, instead of thinking of each of our characters as an isolated thing moving through the world, you've got this web of people who are, I'm not going to say they are each other, but they are a part of each other and influence who we all are. And it's pretty disruptive when you lose a significant other, or a group loses a formative individual. Very disruptive.
What I remember most about Age of Apocalypse is there was no warning.
Right.
You literally just walked into the comic shops and there was Age of Apocalypse.
Yep.
There was almost like we're used to it being like, oh, and in 3 months we're gonna have the we're gonna have the crossover that's gonna change your world, and it's like, nah, not this time. I just remember walking in the rain. I was living in New York City at the time. I was walking in the rain. It was miserable. And I went into Forbidden Planet, and there was Age of Apocalypse.
Wow.
And I was like, what happened to my X-Men?
That was, I think that was one of the coolest parts, is that Age of Apocalypse was a literal sequel to an event book, but they wasted no time jumping into the sequel. You had I remember the ads for Legion Quest, and you're like, okay, well, what is that? And that's going to be interesting. Age of Apocalypse we did not see coming, and you're absolutely right. They didn't really promote that was going to be the result of this previous event. It was just, all focus was on this event, and then it's like, and then this happened, and it almost made it more real, because it didn't seem like an event marketing thing. It was the way the books were. And I was like,
it was something. It went from being a marketing event to an event that just happened.
Right.
Okay, then. Thanks for that fantastic discussion. How about you, Alex? What's your disruptive tale?
Well, again, I'm really well. I'll start off by saying just very quickly that devastation and the world torn apart, and we all blew it, and it's death and destruction really is not my favorite thing ever. I'm more of a half full kind of guy, or yes, we win in the end. But with the Time Machine, it sort of served both purposes for me. It gave me the hope thing, but it also really spoke to what happens if we screw it up. And I think that's sort of what hit me as a kid. Again, I remember it was a Friday, and it was after school, 3 o'clock, and, you get out, and I lived 2 blocks from the school and 3 blocks from the movie theater. So it was like a triangle, straight home to drop off my books, hang a left, walk 3 blocks to the movie theater, step inside, get your popcorn, your Raisinets, get yourself a good seat, just about the middle of the theater.
That's
about
right.
maybe 10 rows back, dead center, so that you had this full panoramic effect. And, you know, as I said, because it's Victorian England to start, it was Rod Taylor as the scientist. And it's an H.G. Wells story, you know, and a number of his other stories that I was familiar with from comic books, not having read the novels, right? So, you know, I'm sort of lost in this Victorian age world, but I'm thinking Sherlock Holmes and I'm thinking this. And then we see the machine, you know, and it's kind of cool. It's like
Very
clockwork.
Cool.
It's, you know, clockwork and levers and brass fittings and and something that spins and sparks. And again, as a kid, it's gadgetry and it's imagery and it's not magic, it's science fiction, you know. And so you understand that this man, this inventor, is kind of on the outside of the society he's living in. He's got thoughts going on in his head that nobody else understands. And as a kid, I totally related to that because I was the weird kid. I was in that 5th grade, 4th grade, I was the only black kid in my class. I was in an intelligence and gifted class. I had them completely fooled. And, you know, and I was the only black kid. And you know, there was no ostracizing from my peers in the class, but my mom was raising me by herself. We were on public assistance. I couldn't do a lot of the things the other kids did. I got to their homes and I saw they had their own room and it was all this and that's their world. But then there was my world, which is so much more small and nuclear. So here's this guy who's got this passion and he's got this belief and he's got this skill and he's got this imagination and he believes this thing can happen and nobody else around him gets it. And I totally got it. And then when he jumps forward, when he finally gets it working, and again, you get this whirlwind of imagery and, you know, he's moving through time. You know, who knew what that was going to be like? But okay, he's dealing with it. Now, of course, as an adult, I go, why didn't you go mad with that concept, right? You know, really, how did your brain deal with it? But okay, he winds up in the future, because I'm doing the abbreviated version of the story. A couple of blips and glitches here, but he winds up in the extreme future. And at first, it's paradise. At first, it's foliage and beauty and nature, and it's all this. And then the underbelly begins to reveal itself. And I found a couple of things, like with the Star Trek episode, where all the people that survived in the future were these pretty white folks with blonde hair. Okay, as a kid at 10 years old, I didn't think about, gee, there's no black people, there's no Chinese people. I didn't think about that. I just thought, oh, these are the people, and they all look young and they have blonde hair or light hair. Okay, and none of them really look like him. All right, and then as he moves through discovering them, they're childlike. They almost are tell me what to do. Like, you know, they don't have any drive. They don't have any purpose. They sort of look, and then you eventually realize they're also food for the other half of society that exists. And that's when it got scary, because to me that was. And in those days, to see people living on the street, you had to go down to the Bowery in New York. You know, it wasn't prevalent everywhere. It wasn't all over the public transportation, things like that. But this was a side of society that was, ooh. You know, and I knew some drunk people, you know, some people who did have problems, whose minds were, you know, because I'd seen them and I'm thinking, oh man, what if the whole world. So as a kid, I'm sitting there now absorbing the possibility that as we move forward in time, we could screw it up. And then the good people would sort of lose their drive, lose their sense of being able to protect themselves, to build better worlds and everything, and would become basically like sheep, because that's what I could connect to, the sheep in the field, right? And then the other side of society would be the wolves. And I as a 10-year-old kid, I'm figuring I'm going to be a sheep. You know, I didn't have to run real fast, and I was a fat kid, so running real fast was not really an option for very long. You know, I could sprint for about a block and a half, and then that was it. You know, so this whole thing of their food, and then here's this guy who again thinks outside the box, who he falls in love with Yvette Mimieux, which wouldn't have been my choice, but okay.
No judgment, no judgment.
And right, no judgment, right? And because he's from a different era where we are more aggressive and mental, he can't strike back against the negative force. And then finally, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen the story, he goes back to his time, gets what he needs, and then the last bit of the story is obviously he's gone back to be a force in making the world better or taking the world into a more productive position. I'm trying to put this in a very PC form.
Gotcha.
Again, whatever happened to all the indigenous people and people of other cultures and natures, we have no idea.
Right.
And again, at 10 years old, that wasn't the question within my mind, but I came away from the story thinking, imagination is power, that what I imagine and what I envision, I can make real, and I should, because I don't want to be like the people in the Victorian era who are sort of like tunnel vision, and I don't want to be a sheep in the future. And so that's what I took away from that story. And again, even when I revisit it and you find the flaws, I still become that 10-year-old kid for a moment with the popcorn and the raisinette.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant.
Give him a hand. All right, then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, as to why I think they did it, H.G. Wells was an amazing individual and very much was what his protagonist was.
Mm-hmm.
Because to be thinking about submarine travel and time machines and things like that in the era that he lived was definitely a man ahead of his time, or at least a man with vision,
Right.
great vision. And you talk about War of the Worlds, and just that whole thing. When you think about Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, Orson Welles, and you think about what he did with that story, the radio story production, I think somehow the why is that we always want to, some writers, some creators will always want to take a look at, this is where we are. What if? What if this doesn't change? What if this happens? What if we remove the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's, the Gandhis, the Mother Teresas? What happens? What do we become? What if we don't get it right? What is the option? And I think that that's one of the reasons this film was done, other than, to make money. I think that that's a great thing from it, as far as I'm concerned.
That's awesome.
What I love, Alex, about what you said there, sort of the what if, kind of harkens back to what you opened with, talking about sort of the glass half full, right? You're talking about you don't really like horror, right, because of sort of the negativity of that sort of glass half empty, right? But the two genres that we usually get these types of stories, horror and sci-fi, and they are meant to communicate different emotions, different thoughts, right? And so with this sort of sci-fi perspective is looking forward and saying, what if we don't get it right? This is how it could go. So we need to think about this so we do get it right. So I really appreciated your sort of that thread of hope through that, and it also reminds me of a little of what Victor was talking about, in that, at least in the universe he was talking about, there was these sort of like, there was an apocalypse either way, right? Which made me then think of like the Terminator, right? Another universe that's sci-fi, right? And for the first several films, they were always trying to stave off Judgment Day, right? But then at the end of the third one, it doesn't happen, which very much violated the expectations of the audience I was in, because some people got up and left before the credits rolled. The character the actor who played John Connor in that sort of had the revelation of, what, we weren't meant to stop Judgment Day, we were meant to survive it, right? Which is essentially in the time machine, right? I mean, there is sort of a Judgment Day, which then leads to the not so idyllic future. Right, but things continued. So this idea of not stopping, perhaps, but surviving, and then surviving in a way that is ideally beneficial, right, from the perspective of the author. That I think is an interesting trend that I'm seeing here.
Yeah,
Well,
no, in the time machine, which I loved watching as a kid as well, and could still watch now. I'm digging on the vibe here of what if, and part of what's creeping through is who's what if, right? And who survives, what survives, and in a lot of the earlier apocalyptic fiction is what if humanity doesn't survive, right? And the idea is it's going to continue. Things are going to go on, just not our way. Right? And I look at these as, what can we do to stop this? And I love it because we don't even know if it's what we're thinking of is going to happen, but it forces us to examine some of the forces we think are working in us, some of the forces that we think are working in the world. And, to go back to Age of Apocalypse, quite often, as we've talked about, anything we do to try to change the past just recreates a different
totally
future.
different thing. Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's the curse of being human being. We are what if systems, and we live off of the what ifs we're generating, and we can't not generate what if, even if it turns out badly. And that's just a curse. And we try to move on with it. And
So we go from what if to what now.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing is that makes this really interesting is if you look at the time machine, and granted you're taking a specific iteration of it, but the concept itself, born from a story first published in 1895. So there are ideas and concepts of this impending apocalypse or the how-to of getting there that we hadn't even hit in history yet. Like, this is before the atomic age, and yet the story itself still carries this weight of something happens that sets us back. And it's the exact same, sort of setup of Planet of the Apes. Something happens that sets us back and allows for someone else to become the dominant force on this planet, where we become, chattel at best, we become food stock, we become a workforce, we are no longer the dominant position. And it's really interesting that H.G. Wells in the writing of this story had this idea of not saying what if, but when this, it's this certainty that the way that things are moving. I mean, this is published post the Civil War, but pre World War I. There's this guarantee that we're going to move into a position where, as a society, we're going to do something that is going to screw everything up. Like, to see that forethought, and again, we're talking almost a solid 50 years before the atomic age begins, and then when the movie version comes out, we're in the heart of the Cold War, happening. That is so, like, was H.G. Wells a time traveler? Like, he had to be. Because how do you write something like this if that's not you? You know what I mean? Like, to say like, hey, there's going to be this thing, So I'm certainly calling this a warning story, because the inevitability of things going wrong is so strong without him possibly knowing the different ways that we have created to make sure that happens. That's before the atomic age, that's before computers, that's before all these different things that we now know today. We're like, oh man, if AI happens, Terminator. And he's like, what's a computer? Like, a computer is a person who counts on their fingers. That's what that was to him. And we're like, no, it's a machine. He's like, a machine? Are you crazy? Like, yeah, that's amazing.
One of the things that I see in Age of Apocalypse, and most recently in they did a Marvel crossover where the Avengers don't come into being, right? And it shows this world, and Mephisto's in charge, and I remember thinking to myself, what would be so much more interesting in that old history is, what if you have a group of people who see in this future where the Avengers don't exist, and the world is actually qualitatively and quantitatively better.
Yeah.
And that instead they have to sacrifice their good for the future as opposed to someone else's good for the future.
That's
right?
a good one.
And that's what I think is interesting. Like this moment where Spider-Man has to come face to face with the fact that Uncle Ben needs to die. Right? And have him have the opportunity to fix that and be like, but if I fix that, then all this other stuff doesn't happen, right? Like, and I think that's actually where time travel becomes really powerful, when the time travel actually forces the primary agent of the story to have to make the sacrifice, as opposed to the primary agent of the story to have to get someone else to make a sacrifice or to defeat someone else.
The
right?
original Star Trek TV series. What was it when Kirk and Spock go back and Kirk
Go
falls
back,
in love?
yeah. And
Oh,
then-
he had to let her
Yeah,
die.
right.
Yeah.
He has to let her die.
And she has to die.
Yeah.
Right?
What I love about disruption stories like that is it just totally disrupts our notion of goodness, right? And somehow there's this good thing we have in us that's going to make the world better. And unintended consequences are 99.9% of the consequences that come from us being around, right? And a good person can just do things that unintentionally do allow things that we would call bad to continue. Thanks for that excellent story, Alex, and thanks for that great conversation, right? So how about you, Eric? What's your disruptive tale?
All right. Well, if I may, submitted for the approval of the Wayne Pop Society.
Yes.
Imagine an isolated, deserted cemetery in rural Pennsylvania. It's mid-afternoon. Dinner time is fast approaching. A lone car traverses the winding road up to that cemetery. A brother and sister emerge from that car to make their annual pilgrimage to visit a family member's grave. And while there, they're accosted by a disheveled man who does nothing but grunt and moan at them. During the struggle, the brother is killed and the sister escapes. Eventually, she finds her way to a farmhouse that also appears to be deserted, until she discovers a partially devoured body upstairs. She's then met by a young man who arrives at the house looking for help, just having escaped a mob of other seemingly rabid folks. They decide to board up the house and take shelter as they notice a handful of shambling, rabid individuals descending upon their location. And eventually, the shock of these things drives the young woman to catatonia. Fortunately, the barriers seem to be keeping the assailants out, and they don't appear intelligent or organized, just myopically focused on breaking into that house and getting them. Now, during this siege, the young man discovers that there's 5 other people hiding out in the basement. A young romantic couple, and an estranged middle-aged husband and wife. The only thing the latter can seem to agree upon is protecting their injured and sick daughter, who had been bitten by one of the assailants on their way to the farmhouse. Bickering amongst the folks began to emerge, particularly as the older man and the younger man fight for dominance. Eventually, they realize they must escape the house to get to one of the military-run installations nearby, which they found out about watching the continuous news broadcasts. They also learn from the news that these assailants are people who have recently died and apparently reanimated. Why? None of the scientists or experts can really agree on why. All they know is that these ghouls are driven to eat living flesh. So the farmhouse survivors devise a plan to aid in their escape. However, communication continues to break down. The people refuse to follow the plans, to do what's best for the collective, and they eventually die, each of them, sometimes by the assailants, and sometimes by each other's hand. Finally, only the young man is left alive. He barricades himself in the basement, which ironically he refused to go into for most of the film. And the assailants have overrun the rest of the farmhouse. They leave after a while, and the man hears gunshots outside. He sneaks upstairs to survey a local posse, hunting down the shambling ghouls. Tragically, a couple of those locals see the young man through the window, and they mistake him for one of the ghouls, and they kill him. And then they burn his body, leaving all knowledge of this desperate story for survival untold, save to the film's audience. Now, I cheated
Oh,
a
you gotta
little.
let us clap, brother.
Yeah. That's good. That's solid.
So,
Well done, man.
thank you. I cheated a little on the why because I'm a big Romero fan, and so I've read a lot of interviews. I've watched all the commentaries on all the DVD iterations. So I know why they said they did what they did, the decisions that they made. And really what a lot of it came down to, at least for that first film, right? This was an evolving universe, but just focusing on Night. This was 68, right? And a lot of social unrest and more to come. And most of the folks working on that film, particularly the writers and director, were liberally oriented, and Romero often said he was just pissed off that the flower child movement didn't work. And so, what would shake up people out of their malaise, right? As we've been talking about these other stories, some type of cautionary tale. He's like, we'll get people to pay attention. Well, what if the dead just got up and started eating people, right? And then the people they ate got up and ate others, right? They'd have to figure it out. And one of the things that is a common thread through all of his films, not just the Dead films, but a lot of his other genre entries, is this issue of communication breaking down, right? What folks would need to do to survive either these global apocalypses or individual apocalypses is working together, right? Putting the damn mask over your face. Right?
Ooh,
Like
preach, bro, preach!
I went there.
Preach! Let's go! Let's go!
Mask? What mask?
Yeah, exactly. And so, but people don't for whatever reason. And so that was this continual larger trope that he always was on throughout his career.
Another thing that was going on in that show was they were theorizing that a satellite had come back to Earth and may be responsible. And what I sort of took from that is everything you just said. You and I have talked about this movie tons, right? And the idea that the writer-director had a certain
viewpoint,
hippie agenda, right? And I totally get it. I'm in. And I also thought there was a bit of technology, not knowing all the intended all the possible consequences of technology, and this mechanistic culture that we're perpetuating because of the happiness or whatever that it brings us can ultimately deselect us, right? Through this unintended consequence of bringing the dead back to life as carnivores. There was a bit of a warning there that if you humans don't keep track or you continue to just try to run as far as you can with technology, unintended consequences are ultimately going to run you over. I don't know, that's about what I got.
Well, to piggyback on that though, like the biggest advancements of technology at the time were all used in war. So the idea of our advance as technologically minded individuals were also rooted in our violence. Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. And it's a thread that, it's a nice baton that's picked up by James Cameron in the Terminator series that, here you go, pushing technology to the forefront. But in fact, what you're pushing for is industrial military, pieces that will in fact bite you in the butt because you can't control these things. That is an unnatural sense of control that will bite you back unnaturally, whether that's AI coming to life or the undead literally rising out of the grave and going, okay, now we're going to eat you because you decided that you were going to play around with this unnatural sense of tech or energy or something like that, and you don't deserve this. So now you're going to get this other turn of what you now deserve.
I'm also going to just chime in very quickly with post-World War II and Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Literally, oh my God, what have I done?
Right.
Which is the quote after dropping the bomb. Or even in the testing grounds in the flats, marching a troop of soldiers into the cloud, thinking you can take the ground once you've blown, whoever to smithereens, and then having all of those human beings die some horrible death over time from radioactive poisoning, because we didn't know what the hell we were doing, even the scientists who set it all up. So ultimately, we are constantly doing, and then someone tells us we did it, and then we go, yeah, we did it, and then someone goes, yeah, we're going to do it again, but it'll be different this time. We are constantly running ahead and not taking any kind of real precautions for protecting lives, globally or otherwise.
Yes.
And we don't seem to learn that lesson, on any level, and even with pollution and things. So I think, Romero, Wells, however we look at it, these disruptive stories keep getting told because we keep doing the same dumb thing.
It's true. Yeah. It's so
We're not
true.
listening.
Right.
Yeah, listening to you guys talk, I've never really placed Night of the Living Dead in the realm of Gothic, but in fact, the roots of Gothic, Frankenstein, the critique of Enlightenment-driven rationalism, and the idea we can think our way through life as opposed to being in life, And it goes from one man creating or reanimating one human being to the whole damn world of dead coming back to life, we're still telling those stories, right? That's fantastic.
Well, it's also that what I think is also interesting is that the dead are, they're mindless, they're subhuman, they have, they are everything that progress is not, right? Instead of eating the bounty of what they make, they eat us.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they are very singular in their purpose. I mean, and you have yeah, you can read a lot of the commentary about how zombies kind of represent communism, this uniformity that takes over, because even though they don't have our thinking skills, they don't have our creative skills, they're just these masses that fall in line and just do and do and do and do. You can wipe them out, and then more just rise to take up their place, mm-hmm. right? I mean, I find that to be really interesting, and that's always what's got me about it was about zombies in general. Is it's very simple, right? They're mm-hmm. not they're not these super complicated creatures. Evolutionary in terms of evolution, I mean, they are like sharks and alligators. They're really right. simple. They're not pretty,
right?
But you know what? It doesn't matter if it's pretty or not. It's eating you.
They get the job done. Yeah,
they do. That's right.
Right.
And if
but
I may,
also, oh sure.
Oh, just that you're right. I mean, the way Romero often would think about the zombies is, I mean, even some of his characters would say they're us, right? The zombies were like a force of nature. He would say that they could be anything. Any type of apocalyptic force. It's his interest was the real bad guys, if you will, were the ones who were breaking down human cooperation.
Right.
And as later films progressed, he did start playing with the idea of, well, zombies aren't going anywhere, right? Biden gets you to become a zombie, but everybody in that universe will eventually become a zombie unless they incinerate themselves, right? They will reanimate. And so he's like, we got to learn to coexist. And so they play with ideas of, do the zombies, can they be trained? Do they have consciousness? Unfortunately, we don't know where he would have gone with the series.
Right.
But those are sort of two major things that he had used the zombies for.
It is interesting that in all of our showcases, there is a group of people that are either mindless or myopic in their focus of the way that they do things, whether that's the zombies in Night of the Living Dead. You've got the future either cattle-like minded people of the Time Machine, or the Infinites that are the front guard in Age of Apocalypse. There's this statement that there has to be a ton of people that are only there to be there. Like, that is your whole purpose, in a sense, is you are just there. Because like with Night of the Living Dead, the story, the zombies, and in the best zombie stories, I think this is true, they're always the backdrop. They are the dressing that's in the background, but they are never the actual story. It is about the people that are involved around this massive thing that is myopic in its movement, in its focus. That is the story. And I think that's very interesting that in these apocalyptic tales, that seems to be a necessity.
I love what you're saying here, because by making the other abject and extremely simple, mm-hmm. what seems to be going on in the narrative is an exploration of the we, right? And pulling out the degrees of freedom in terms of who we think we are. And I think this is a perfect segue to Stanford's story, because we'll see if there is an abject other in Stanford's story. So Stanford, please go ahead.
Okay.
Speak.
All right. So in my story, The Girl with All the Gifts, it takes place in a near future. Where humanity has been ravaged by a disease caused by a parasitic fungus that transmits through bodily fluids. So this is essentially a zombie story. The big difference between these zombies and the zombies in Romero's Night of the Living Dead is that, Romero zombies could do could do their 100 meters in about 10 and a half minutes, and these zombies can do the 100 meters in about 10 and a half seconds. And they're actually not called zombies, they're called the Hungries, right? And it actually opens on a military base. And in the military base, they have these children. And these children, it looks like they're being detained. They're being moved from place to place. They're being, they're in their cells and they're being forced to put on these helmet type things with muzzles. And you start to realize that that these children are also the Hungries. Except for these are the hybrid second generation Hungries that seem to retain some minimal ability to think and learn. They have very little communication, but they're kind of marched around, and we're trying to figure out what are they doing with these kids, and very quickly find out that they're experimenting on these kids because they're like, oh, these kids have retained some of their abilities, so they're looking to these kids to find a cure for this parasitic fungus type disease, right? So, we get a little more world building inside the camp. We see that some of that you've got this military doctor played by Glenn Close who's heading up the whole we got to remember these are just walking samples. And then you've got this teacher who's actually responsible for teaching them because they're trying to figure out how much learning they can do, right? So she's in there trying to assess what humanity these children have retained. Of course, everything goes hunky-dory until something happens and the entire encampment gets overrun by Hungries. They just come in from the outside and it's complete and utter chaos. The military is doing the best they can, but they just get overwhelmed because that's the problem of fighting zombies, right? Is whenever you engage the zombies, you have a couple casualties. Those casualties end up filling the ranks of the zombies. It gets more complicated, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. So a small group escape with one of the second generation Hungries, and the second generation's this Hungry is named Melanie, and she's a young girl, and she's black. And she's actually the only black person in this story.
True.
So there's always one.
There's always one, right?
Sometimes only one.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's we kind of toggle between this girl's perspective and these caretakers, right? And so the whole thing is that Glenn Close we gotta grab one of the Hungries, we gotta bring them with us because we're gonna escape to this other base in London, right? So a whole section of the story is all about them escaping, and throughout they're bringing along Melanie, and she's being forced to be docile because they're afraid that she's gonna lose control and she's gonna bite one of them. And there are a couple moments where she does look like she's gonna lose control, and there's a couple moments where she does. But it's always about controlling this little black girl, right? This little black girl who has the promise of being the thing the person who saves humanity, right? And so they work their way to London, and when they get to London, as they get towards this population center that's been decimated, at one point they are able to take, they get stranded in they go and they get stranded in a hospital. And it's revealed that they have this gel that they can put on that blocks their scent, so they can kind of walk amongst them. But if they don't do a good job of faking it, they still get munched on, right? So while they're in the hospital, Glenn Close's character reveals a little more about what they've learned and where the second generation of Hungries came from. And they kind of see it in the hospital because they see women that are just torn apart from the inside. And so the second generation of Hungries, most of them are kids who were infected in utero and literally tore themselves out of their mothers. and we go deeper into the city. It's like deeper into the heart of darkness, and at some point we encounter these groups of young feral hungries. You know, they look like they could be Melanie easily, right? Except for they're not bound, they're not chained, they're not wearing muzzles, and they act almost like roving packs of dogs. They do coordinate with one another, you know, and they're able to, and of course, they're able to knock out a couple more of the crew of Melanie's escorts, and they work their way over to another lab, and they've got and you've got the feral hungries coming up on them, and we finally get to this point where they've been able to go in and out of the lab a little bit. The BT Tower in London, you know, we start to, you know, as we get closer, we start to see more like fungus growths, and we see that like the BT Tower is entirely encased in these funguses with these little spore pods on them, and they're like, and they realize that it's like that like the spores have been building up, and they're like, if those spores are released, it's over for humanity, because once you release it, because they find out in a smaller area that you release a poof of spores, and there ain't nothing you can do, right? And so so we're getting towards the end, and the ferals come after the group, and Melanie goes to the lead feral and beats him to death with a bat. And when that happens, it's like they declare her the alpha, and so the ferals start to listen to Melanie, and so this is happening, and then they're worried. They're like, "Oh my God, that thing looks like it's gonna burst soon. We got to figure out what we're gonna do with that." And so the one woman who's the teacher, you know, she's back towards the lab, and Glenn Close's character, the doctor, she goes out, and there's this moment where everything's in place, everything's, you know, what's going to happen, and the doctor calls on Melanie to like come back, because all they need is to be able to dissect her, and they will have the cure. And Melanie is torn between these caretakers who need her for the cure, and then now she sees these feral hungries that are very much like her, that she now has influence over her. And then she looks over at the teacher who's been kind to her, right? And Melanie has to make a choice what to do now. So Melanie makes the most logical Melanie choice. She lights the spores on fire, releasing them into the atmosphere. And Glenn Close's character, all the other characters, everybody dies except for the teacher, because she's trapped in the lab. It's in a hermetically sealed box. And it ends with the spores being released to transform the rest of humanity into hungries. And she is stuck in this hermetically sealed box, almost like it's a cage. And all of the young feral hungries are sitting there watching her as she teaches them from her cage. And that's the end of the story. Right. And what I love about this story is...
And then let us clap for you.
Yeah. That's good stuff.
What I love about this story is it's what it says about race, gender, and childhood in the context of positing the next step in the zombie story, right? Mm-hmm. Whenever we see these stories about zombies, it's always centered on us, right? It's always centered on, oh, we need to get rid of these things that are trying to take over, as opposed to what this is kind of hinting at is that this is actually our next evolution, right? And you see that in Melanie's character, but it emerges out of Melanie. You can't get past the fact that this is a young black girl that's being abused, right, that's being dragged along in chains, that recognizes that these unfortunately, these white people are her parental figures. They're the ones who are taking care of her. But throughout, they're also taking away her agency. And what I love is that in that moment, it's actually it's a moment of agency. It's a moment where she says, I get to choose what's best for me. I get to decide what the next step is. Because it wasn't about her saying, we want to wipe out all of humanity. It's like, I am literally the crossroads. Which road are we going to go?
Yeah.
And she doesn't get rid of the last of the human crew that she's with. I mean, she's still having them teach them and move forward. So it becomes almost like not only just a generational passing of the baton, but a species transition.
Yep.
And I find that to be most interesting because in the back of my mind, when I watch a zombie film, I just run the numbers, right? It's that you can't have that many dead people walking the earth and have that many live people for more than a couple months.
Right.
Like the numbers just don't work. And I think that it's also interesting that we have this idea that these zombies could not be sentient. If you look at like how humans have behaved during our evolution, right?
Right.
And so this idea that they do default to an organizational structure, that there is some sort of transformation taking place here, and there is a transformation in which it's not so much about them feeding off of us, because obviously they're going to still have to feed when we're gone, right? It's that,
or do they? That's always my favorite question when it comes to the zombie proliferation idea. Is we have this concept that they will starve, but do they? Like, is eating for them the same thing as eating for us? They are a different species, like you said. I think this is such a great conversation point of the apocalypse being the transition of humanity as we understand it versus the end of the world. It is not the end of the world.
Exactly.
It is a definitive change as to what is humanity, and that's dope.
So I cheated because Stanford told me what his tale was going to be, so I watched it last night.
Nice.
It was the best damn zombie movie I've ever seen. There's after she lights the pyre and lets the seeds basically explode, the archetypal military white male starts to inhale the seeds, and he asks her basically says, it's all over, this is the end of everything. And she goes, no, it's not the end, it just won't be yours.
Right.
And that whole movie was written for that line.
Man.
And it's this thing where we go from, as we go from Victor's story, Alex's story, we see this creeping up of what's being kept the same, and it tends to be our view of what is good, our view of what should continue. And that zombie story, man, it's like, no, it's going to continue. It's just not going to be your story.
That's right.
Ouch.
but
that's the story of the future, though.
Exactly.
But it's interesting because their journey also shows. It actually shows the wages of oppression, right? Like, just you can't get past that symbolism of the black girl always having her agency taken away and being expected to sacrifice her life for the good of everyone else, right?
Very true.
And I find that to be really interesting because there's also this thing built in there. It's like, well, maybe if you had a little more compassion for her, you wouldn't have ended up like this.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's interesting because they never tell the origin of the fungus, right? They don't tell if it's cosmic, if it's an unintended consequence of technology
pollution or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's just there, and your comment about her as a young black girl. I love the vibe where the world isn't as you see it. And all these things you're doing probably zombie-like, to be honest. Right. Driving the car, wearing the clothes, doing the job, keeping certain people in and certain people out, right? That feels like what's right to you, and that's your story, but it's not the only one, and it only feels like the only one because you've created a world where you can't hear the others, right?
I just want to say, just because I just had this Disney moment, and I'll explain that in a second. I was talking at an event years ago after the Black Panther movie came out, and at the event, someone had asked me this question about why did I think the executives at Disney decided to do a movie for black people? And I said, I don't think that was a discussion at the table. I think that they decided to make this movie. I said, let us remember that they are the same people who gave us Song of the South.
That's right.
Right, and then
That's
you
right.
have the Black Panther. Well, what we just did was we just went from the black guy in Night of the Living Dead to the black girl and the girl with all the gifts.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
That's real.
I just
That's
meant,
real.
oh snap!
Right.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Oh my God, that's solid.
You know,
That's solid.
Fantastic.
and
And then
exactly,
also in
in
the
Romero's thing, he dies, and in this
Mhm.
one, not again.
Not this
Not
time.
again.
Not this time.
Thank you for that fantastic story, Stanford, and for that great discussion, everyone. And I didn't intend any order in all of this, but it really worked out well because Stanford's telling of the girl with all the gifts, a lot of people would call that post-humanism, right? Looking at reality, not from a humanistic lens, but decentering our notions of humanity, and trying to look at what we are in a, I guess, a larger frame, which might be logically impossible given we are humans. So we write these stories that decenter us. And so I got to tell you, the story that I want to tell is Arthur C. Clarke's 1953 novel, Childhood's End. And I said I was 16 when I read it. And so imagine it's the 1950s. You are a German rocket scientist who was captured by the Americans at the end of World War II. And basically you're developing their rocket program for them. And you know that your other German colleague who was captured by the Soviets and is now building rockets for them. And you know that you're competing with that person. You're about to launch the first rocket. And suddenly this huge shadow just comes over everything. It's a massive spaceship, and you realize your endeavors are pointless now. So that's the beginning of Childhood's End. And what happens is over about 60 days, these huge spaceships that look like the ships that we see in the beginning of Independence Day, they're just huge. They park themselves over all of the major cities on the earth. And they just don't say anything for a while. And eventually, after about 60 days, this voice comes across all the radio frequencies in the world, and it says, Earth's affairs are now being taken over. All right, there will be no more violence as you're used to. They lay down all these rules. The South African government refuses to give up its discrimination policies. So these creatures who have come to be called the overlords, though no one's ever seen them, they actually blot out the sun over South Africa for a half an hour on the day. I mean, this is just technology that we have no clue how to understand. There's a bullfight that's going on in Madrid. And as the matador stabs the bull, every single person in the audience experiences the stab. And so what you see then is this sort of violence ending on the planet. And you start to see rebellion, this group called the Freedom League. They object to what the overlords are trying to get us to create, which is called the World Federation, right? And so this religious group known as the Freedom League, they try to engage in some hijinks. Nothing really comes of it, though. I mean, it's minor plot line. But the way that we communicate with the overlords now is this one person, the Secretary General of the UN, gets in this little silver orb every once in a while, and it takes him up to the spaceship, and he's in a small room, and he has a conversation with the character known as Carolyn. That's all we know of Carolyn. And they have a conversation across the stream. Carolyn tells him the overlord's demands. You know, the UN Secretary General tells Carolyn what's going on. Of course, they already know what's going on. And this goes on for quite a long time. And eventually, in order to make some peace, people on Earth start demanding that the overlords let us see what they look like. And Carolyn tells the UN Secretary General, tell your people we'll show ourselves in 50 years. We're not going to show you who we are now. So, just as this UN Secretary General is getting close to the end of his career, he decides to take an X-ray machine and a camera with him, so he can, or a flashlight with him, so he can kind of see what this guy looks like. And he gets a glimpse of what Carolyn looks like, but we're not told at that moment what Carolyn looks like. Then the story picks up. 50 years later, it's the day the world has waited for. Cameras, reporters all around the ship that kind of hovers down close to the planet. The doors open, and suddenly 10-foot tall Satan walks out of the spaceship. And of course, the world's blown away. And of course, they waited for 50 years for the world to get over some ways of thinking that would allow them to actually interact. So then the story picks up. It goes on years later. There's this island in Greece that a bunch of artists create so that we can keep human creativity alive, because what's happened is the overlords have basically minimized human struggle. So there's no war, there's no struggle for food, healthcare is all there. So there's still artists that are still struggling to be creative in this place with no struggle. And what happens then is some of the children on the earth start to develop what you would call powers, I guess, that violate the laws of physics, making things hover, reading people's minds. And so all this is going on. And then another and there's one at one of the houses on this island in Greece, one of these artists has a party. And one of the overlords comes to the party. They've kind of become part of the furniture and the culture right now. But the overlords don't party with us. What they do is they go to the libraries and they scour every library they can about humanity's mystic past, right? They look at everything they can on the paranormal in human history that's been recorded. So while that's going on, the woman who's hosting the party has a brother. And that brother chats with the overlord for a bit, and he decides, he's an astrophysicist, he decides he's going to stow away to the overlord's planet. So one of the subplots that develops is that he gets himself put inside the corpse of a killer whale that is being sent to the overlord's planet as sort of a zoo exhibit, right? So the overlords are collecting exhibits about our planet, and they're taking it back. Of course, so he's gone with the overlords. We'll come back to our story now. So he's out there on their planet, and the kids on Earth are growing stronger and stronger. And eventually what happens is all the kids on Earth actually levitate and fly away to a common location. And when they get there, they start dancing. And over time, their dancing becomes increasingly synchronous. Now, this is hundreds of thousands of kids, right? And since these kids started to be born, no other kids are being born. So the vibe you get is this is the last generation of humanity. And then as these kids start to dance, you can see that their dances are actually collectively transforming the laws of physics on Earth. So what happens is these children continue to dance, and as they continue to dance, our astrophysicist, who's over on Overlord planet, he gets to see their planet, and it looks like all of our descriptions of hell. It's red, lava, gaseous, all the images that we associate with hell. However, Carolyn, the guy who's befriended him, it's incredibly nice to him. Doesn't harm him in many ways, prevents him from harming himself. So anyway, the way the story starts is that this young astrophysicist actually makes his way back to Earth with the overlords at roughly the same time as these kids are changing the laws of physics. And then what Carolyn tells this astrophysicist is as follows. Okay, your species can become part of something bigger. Your species can become part of what we call the overmind, the cosmic life force of the universe. Our species cannot. We actually serve them. So we go from planet to planet, making sure that they don't destroy themselves before the time of ascension, right? So he asked the astrophysicist, what do you want to do? Do you want to come back with us? He says, no, I'll go down to the planet and vanish with the planet, and I'll just give you last minute details of what happens. So the astrophysicist goes to they put him down there, and he's keeping, he's telling them everything he's seeing as it's going on. And you can tell that Carolyn is very kind of sad in an overlordish kind of way that this young man chose to leave. And then the way the story ends is that the children of the earth actually destroy the earth. They consume the structure of the earth and collectively join what would be called the cosmic overmind. And they leave. And that's it.
Wow.
And I gotta tell you, man, when I read that story at 16, that was the first post-human story I'd ever read. That was the first thing where it's like, maybe we ain't all that, right? And then all these dichotomies of, Satan being the intelligence that was getting us to a point that we get to join the cosmic mind. Yeah, but that means humanity's gone, right? I mean, just all the wonderful contradictions. It's kind of like The Girl with All the Gifts, where you just reframe what's ending and what's beginning. And that story stuck with me forever. And it's just, things ain't always what you're working for. The world ain't always what you say it is. And trying to keep that open. So I'll shut up. Oh, thank you very much. I was so glad to be able to share that story with you guys, man. I absolutely love it.
Listen, there's a reason why at 16 I didn't read that book, because I don't know if I could have handled that. that would have been a little too much for my young mind.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, what I also find interesting about it is that in their going back and looking at, Carolyn's people going back and looking at the occult, right? And our history is that it's also like this whole thing of like, we've been interacting with them.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the face of that type of change, we could do nothing but ascribe it evil.
Yes, that's exactly.
And build our society around resisting it, right?
Right.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that also in terms of the girl with all the gifts, right? Is that these stories are also stories of America, right? Stories of an America where like it or not, it's had to accommodate change.
Yep. Where change is the evil.
I agree
What?
with Stanford, and I would say that any organization, a single cell, a multicellular organism, you as a unit, groups, all of these things necessarily create boundaries to be systems. And there's no way that you can be a thing without boundaries. And so when I read these kinds of stories, it's just what I would call the beautifully ugly curse of being, right? You're a system, you're going to generate boundaries to keep that system. Now, I'm not trying this, for me, this is beyond right and wrong. This is just about what does it take to be? And what it takes to be is necessarily border construction that comes out of what you are. Right. And so I agree with you. The United States is a culture that has had to face change and has faced that change in horrid ways. I would argue that that's not unique to the United States in terms of
childhood's end. What I love about that is the title, right? Is the title, what the title does in terms of contextualizing the end of the world, right? The end of the world as we know it. But this isn't just, actually, this is not the end. This is actually the physical end of the world, right?
Right.
Because it's being taken apart and put into something else.
Right.
So
We're growing up.
yes.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
like the cosmic childhood.
Yeah, and also it ties in very nicely with that quote I sort of messed up a bit from Neil deGrasse at the beginning about how we look at alien life form and how and their behavior. We tend to make it more often than not evil, but that's a reflection of us and how we see life as opposed to how aliens might actually be or whatever. I see that sort of it's just very fascinating. And I liked your story. It's funny because I also think about it when you were talking. It made me think of the day the Earth stood still, and a couple of other films that a thread of that filtered through, or there's a different variation on the story of alien life on this planet and how we connect to it, and whether or not they're overlords, or even the Twilight Zone story of
Disturbed Man.
Yeah, Disturbed
right.
Man. You know, this is like, wow, where do we fit in the much bigger cosmic picture? Because I could never, and this is going back to the childhood thing, you know, America, Western civilization, I suppose, you know, I don't know that much about. I mean, I haven't lived within the Japanese culture, but if I think about Japan's history to a certain degree, and the, you know, and shoguns and warriors and samurais and all that, yeah, there's a certain mindset about power and about conquest and staking your claim and setting up rules and framework that humanity seems to replicate, no matter what culture you're talking about. And I know that for humanity to think that we're it in the universe is like the biggest example of egotism I have ever conceived. No, we can't be it. I would hope that whatever is beyond it is better together than we are, more together than we are. But I could never believe that this is all there is, because if this is all there is, boy, did the Almighty screw up.
Well, gentlemen, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for coming together. We're going to go around, and if you're interested, please tell people where they can find you on social media, and we'll start with Eric.
So you can find me on the Department of Psychology's webpage, Illinois State University. You can find me on Twitter at Eric Wesselman, and you can find my film blog if you Google film culture, normal theater.
Fantastic. How about you, Stanford?
You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Clubhouse at SW Carpenter.
Fantastic. How about you, Alex?
You can find me on Facebook at Alex Simmons, and also on Instagram at Simmons _ Alexander. And those are the two probably best places. Oh, and my website, of course, which is Simmons Here and Now, all written out. SimmonsHereandNow.com.
Fantastic. And how about you, Victor?
You guys can find me at Vantage In-House on all forms of social media. Definitely check out VantageInhouse.com to read some of the best books not written by Alex or Stanford, because they're pretty awesome guys as well. You can also check me out.
Because you haven't asked us
yet. You can also find me at U Cre-8 Comics, which is the letter U, CRE, the number 8 comics.com. That helps you make your own comic book universe from start to finish.
Fantastic. You can find me on Twitter at @dark_loops. You can also find me on YouTube at the Dark Loops Productions channel. Until next year, Wayne Pop, goodbye, and thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
See you in the apocalypse.
Not if I see you first.